This episode was suggested by a listener, Nicola, via our website. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. We apologize for this episode being late. I had the worst head cold I've had in a long time, and it took me a while to recover. My voice still may be a little rough, so I apologize and thank you for your patience. The information in this episode is meant for interest only. All of the plants mentioned in this episode can cause injury or death. The remedies discussed are historical and not recommended as forms of medical treatment. We do not support the ingestion or use of any of these plants, or any known toxic plants for that matter. Therefore, the MCP and I cannot be held responsible for any injury caused by the misuse of these plants. Please be responsible, and if you think you have ingested something poisonous, call your local emergency services immediately. And now, on with the podcast. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Most of us view a garden as a place of beauty, comfort, and safety. This is for the most part true, but it's also true that some of the most common garden plants are highly poisonous. For example, daffodil bulbs can cause nasty stomach upset when eaten, and autumn crocuses can cause paralysis and death. Both of these flowers aren't considered poisonous plants, but contain substances that are highly toxic to humans and other mammals. These toxic, poisonous substances are called alkaloids. Alkaloids are organic compounds, mostly derived from plants, that have a pronounced physiological effect on humans, such as causing convulsions, paralysis, hallucinations, as well as other effects on the muscles, heart, lungs, and brain. Because of these effects, alkaloids have been utilized for pharmacological purposes from very early in human history. Some alkaloids have been isolated from their plant origins and are still used in modern medicine today as antimalarials, anti-cancer drugs, and painkillers. Others, mostly those that cause psychotropic and stimulating effects, have been used in both religious rituals as well as recreational drugs. Some of these alkaloids are incredibly toxic and have been utilized as poisons throughout history. These are the ones we'll be talking about in this episode. Poisonous plants have played a major part in history, both in medicine as well as mythology and superstition. There's so much information out there on this topic that I have to summarize in this episode, something I'm not really used to doing. However, if I didn't summarize, this episode would be well over 2 hours long, maybe longer. So, in summary then, but let me know if there are any topics that you'd like me to cover in more detail. The actual discovery of the properties of toxic plants and the development of their practical uses has been lost to history. It's most likely the poisonous effects were discovered by accident, and then experimentation, either on the self or others, resulted in the careful use of certain plants for certain activities. The alkaloids, or active ingredients of these plants, were not isolated until the 1800s, but we do have documentation of the use of plants containing alkaloids from quite early in history. There is evidence of the use of yew, a poisonous wood, from Paleolithic England before 9000 BCE, and evidence of opium poppy residue in Neolithic archaeological sites from between 4,300 and 2000 BCE in Europe. Opium poppies may have been cultivated in the Mediterranean as early as 6000 BCE. The first use of toxic plants as poisons isn't known, but the first documented incident comes from the 3rd century BCE, when Apollodorus of Alexandria, who was well versed in toxicology, began testing poisons on convicted criminals. Poisoning was so common in ancient Rome, it was possible to become a professional poisoner. It was such a popular method of ousting royalty that the position of food taster as a first line of defense against poisoning was already in use in the 1st century BCE. However, it didn't work the same way TV and films suggest. The taster could not just eat a spoonful of the suspected food just before the king did. They had to be observed for a few hours after eating, as some poisons were known to be slow-acting. As far back as ancient Rome, poisons and toxic plants were also associated with witchcraft. Witches were thought to be capable of inflicting all manner of ills on people, such as crop blights, and bringing disease among herd animals and people. They were said to work their wicked magic through plants. Throughout history, some 200 plants have been said to be used by witches for medicine, magic, and poisons. The most famous poisonous plants associated with witches are aconite, belladonna, hemlock, henbane, mandrake, and opium poppy, all of which I will talk about later in this episode. Most of these were used in what was called the witch's flying ointment, which was said to give witches the ability to fly to their meeting places on the witches' Sabbath. Carlo Ginzburg, an Italian historian, has suggested that the flying ointment was actually meant to encourage hallucinatory dreaming. The ointment would have created a dreamlike waking state, or possibly an immersive dream while asleep, due to the opposing effects of the alkaloids in belladonna and opium poppy. However, there were also unpredictable toxic effects from combining any or all of these toxic plants. Other authors believe this ointment was a way to get high, and that the people that were called witches at the time were actually medieval drug addicts. During the height of the witchcraft epidemic of the 17th century in Europe, women became the focus of witchcraft superstition. If a woman had any of these plants growing on her property, it was enough to raise suspicion of her being a witch. Even with this suspicion and the threat of eternal damnation for associating with witches, many people went to these so-called witches for medicine. This was due to the thought that because witches could cause disease, they could also cure it. Most people couldn't afford a physician, therefore witches, wise women, wise men, and other folk practitioners were a staple of healthcare for most towns and cities. Not only witches were thought to be able to cure disease, priests too were thought to be great healers. Every religion has its own plant lore and legends. Some religions make use of toxic plants for healing, or use their hallucinogenic properties as a method of conversing with their gods or having prophetic visions. In medieval Europe, the God-fearing poor turned to monasteries and almshouses for healing. Monasteries during the Norman period in England included large medical gardens and functioned almost like hospitals, as caring for the poor and sick was considered the greatest Christian charity. The Normans, who conquered the Anglo-Saxons, didn't do away with their medical knowledge. In fact, they valued it and encouraged monks to study and catalog the plants in the Anglo-Saxon texts. These monasteries grew and used many toxic plants. However, they were unable to accurately measure dosage, therefore caution was advised. 12th century herbal remedy shops, called apothecaries, have their roots in these monasteries. Early pharmacies have their roots in these apothecaries, and so on until the evolution of the first modern pharmacies in the mid-1800s. The reason these monasteries knew what to grow and how to administer it was because monasteries were the only places where the voluminous medical texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans were retained after Christianity replaced paganism in most of Europe. Among the most influential herbal texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans was Hippocrates' work, Corpus Hippocraticum, written sometime in the 1st century BCE. It's a collection of medical writings, mostly on the humoral system of medicine, which we covered in Part 1 of our Hysteria episode. This text references many extracts of toxic plants as medicines for all sorts of real diseases, as well as imbalances of the four humors. Dioscorides was a Greek physician who served the infamous Emperor Nero between 50 and 70 CE. He wrote a 5-volume text, which in Latin is called De Materia Medica. This text describes about 600 plants with medical or practical uses, including information collected from ancient Egyptian and Carthaginian cultures. This work was passed on and copied all over Europe and Asia all the way up until the 17th century, eclipsing Hippocrates' text. Pliny the Elder, who wrote around the same time as Dioscorides, also produced a text that contains medical uses of plants, called Historia Naturalis. His text also contains the superstitions associated with certain plants. This work was also copied without question by many future physicians. While medieval monastic authors of herbal texts used these Greek and Roman books to create their own herbals, taking the work of the Roman writers at face value, Islamic physicians moving into southern Europe also translated and copied them, but added their own herbal information. As conflict between Christians and Muslims slowed with the end of the Crusades, the combination of Islamic and classical herbal texts spread all across Europe. The earliest English-language herbal text was the Leech Book of Bald from around 900 to 950 CE, where leech is the Anglo-Saxon or Old English term for physician or healer. This book was mostly based on native British plants, with references to Dioscorides. The first illustrated English herbal was the Herbarium Apulei Platonici from around 1000 to 1050 CE, written by an unknown author who claimed to be Apuleius of Maraura. Avicenna, a Persian physician, wrote his Canon of Medicine around 1025 CE, which contained an overview of medical knowledge from the Islamic world, classic Greek and Roman medicine, and the medical traditions of the Chinese, Persians, and Indians. This text became the standard of medicine until the 18th century and contained many herbal remedies. From the Renaissance period, we have what are called receipt books, which were compiled by upper-class women and contained recipes for medicine, food, and usually several purging recipes, which caused upwards or downwards purges, meaning vomiting or diarrhea, which were to be used in case of poisoning. These medicines were made of toxic plants, and some recipes in these books were purely poison. Many upper-class homes included a still room, a place for distilling plant material to create extracts and tinctures, and this room was considered a woman's domain. This is possibly where the stereotype of poison being a woman's method of murder comes from. In 1596, John Gerard, a barber surgeon, published an extensive herbal text that contained over 1,000 plants, some with medicinal properties. This book was edited and annotated in 1633 and 1636 by apothecary Thomas Johnson. His book and his student Nicholas Culpeper's herbal text became the authority on plants and herbs from this point until the 1900s. In Victorian England, the passion for plants and flowers in general blossomed. It was the Victorians who invented the culture of flowers, assigning meaning to certain blooms in order to conduct love affairs, or to say with flowers what could not be spoken with words. Women and flowers became connected again, not just because of this clandestine sex and courtship language, but also because the study of plants, or botany, was seen as an area of science that women could participate in. The nightshade family of plants, which includes belladonna, mandrake, henbane, hemlock, and aconite, all of which we'll talk about in a moment, had a very interesting spot in the Victorian culture of flowers. These plants were considered edgy, as they had previous associations with witchcraft, as well as being poisonous. They were given new meanings. For example, belladonna was said to mean silence or deadly charm, mandrake, horror, and henbane indicated imperfection. Mrs. Maud Grieve, a London herbalist, compiled her own complete herbal text in 1931 called A Modern Herbal. Her book included the latest scientific data of the time as well as the traditional uses of these toxic plants. Many toxic plants have been utilized as medicine, and the active ingredients in some of them have been isolated and are still in use today. I want to get into the specifics of 7 of these alkaloid-containing plants, ones that are particularly dangerous and have made a mark on history, for better or worse. But before I do, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 30,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 60 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, get updates on previous episode topics, and see photos of my foster cats. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly pub quiz, where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the sources I've used while researching each episode. And at $20 per episode, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, I've reviewed horror video games and famous morbid pieces of art. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. There are many toxic plants that have featured heavily in the history of humanity, either as poisons, drugs, or medicine. The 7 I'm going to list in this episode are among the most poisonous plants in the world. The first 6 were all ingredients of the witch's flying ointment that I mentioned earlier. Please let me know if you'd like an episode on witches as physicians, because it's a topic I'd love to do now that I've read a little bit about it. One of the most famous of these toxic ingredients is aconite, also known as monkshood and wolfsbane. Professor Snape quizzes Harry Potter on this plant in the very first Harry Potter book. While he mentions that all 3 names refer to the same plant, Professor Snape doesn't mention how poisonous the plant is. He also didn't mention that aconite is known by several other names, including Blue Rocket, Queen of Poisons, Friar's Cap, and Devil's Helmet. Aconite has blue to purple flowers in the shape of a little hood, which is how it got the name monkshood. The flowers, leaves, stems, and roots are all very toxic, as they all contain the alkaloid aconitine. The roots, however, are the most poisonous part of the plant. Aconitine is mainly a paralytic, meaning it causes paralysis. Symptoms of poisoning appear between 20 minutes and 2 hours after ingesting the plant or its extract, and include tingling and numbness in the mouth, the sensation of ants crawling all over the body, sweating, and nausea. This leads to severe vomiting, intense pain, then labored breathing, lowered heart rate, paralysis of the skeletal muscles, and finally death caused by paralysis of the heart and lungs. If enough of the plant is ingested, death may occur immediately. Even brushing up against this plant with bare skin can cause numbness and tingling at the site of contact. If the plant comes in contact with even the smallest cut in the skin, the whole body can be affected. Treatment of aconite poisoning is mainly supportive, as there is no antidote. Activated charcoal can be used to decontaminate the stomach, which is one of the only real uses for activated charcoal. The drug lidocaine and some heart stimulants, such as caffeine, can ease the symptoms, but only if used within an hour of poisoning, and even then, their effectiveness depends on how much aconite the victim has ingested. In Greek mythology, aconite was said to spring from the saliva that fell from the mouth of Cerberus, or Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guards the path out of Hades, or Hell. The ancient Greeks used aconite to poison their arrows as well as meat traps while hunting wolves, hence the name wolfsbane. Aconite has been used by several other cultures for poisoning hunting implements. The Minaro of Ladakh in India used it on their arrows to hunt ibex. The Ainu of Japan used it to hunt bear, and the Aleuts of Alaska used it on their spears for hunting whales. While extracts of aconite were used as painkillers and fever reducers in the early stages of modern medicine, its alkaloid aconitine has been set aside due to the risks involved in calculating safe dosage. The amount of aconitine in each plant is not consistent and largely depends on the environment in which it grows, making dosage calculations extremely complicated. The next infamous plant I'd like to talk about is belladonna, or Atropa belladonna, which is also known as deadly nightshade, devil's cherries, divale, and dwayberry. Belladonna has been known as a poison since before ancient Greek writers documented it as such. Its generic name, Atropa, is derived from the name of one of the three fates of Greek mythology, who spin the threads of human life, measure them, and then cut them, ending life. Atropos was the fate that cut the threads of life. All parts of belladonna are poisonous because they contain atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, which are all highly toxic alkaloids. Just brushing past this plant can be dangerous, especially if it gets into a small cut or abrasion. Even the honey made from the pollen of this plant can contain its dangerous alkaloids. Belladonna gives off a strong, foul smell, but it produces sweet, juicy-looking berries, which often lure the uninformed to fatal consequences. Eating more than 2 to 3 berries can kill an adult. Symptoms of poisoning include dilated pupils, loss of balance, paralysis of the central nervous system, delirium or the inability to tell reality from fantasy, attention span issues, consciousness and cognition disturbances, convulsions, and hallucinations. The ancient Romans specifically valued belladonna as a poison. Agrippina the Younger supposedly paid Locusta, a professional poisoner, to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius, with belladonna. Livia Drusilla was also rumored to have poisoned her husband, Emperor Augustus, with it. According to some medieval texts, belladonna belongs to the devil, and he tends to it every day. The modern popular name belladonna, which means beautiful lady in Italian, is said to come from a Renaissance-era tale that an extract of the plant was used by Italian women to dilate their eyes, which was thought to be highly attractive at the time. Belladonna was cultivated in England from at least the 16th century as a sleep aid, muscle relaxer, anti-inflammatory, and menstruation aid. Early references call it Solanum lethale, but this was changed officially to Atropa belladonna in 1809. Belladonna has also been used as a recreational drug due to the vivid hallucinations and delirium it causes. These hallucinations are often incredibly unpleasant, and using belladonna in this way is very risky as it's very easy to fatally overdose. In 1916, the alkaloid atropine was isolated from the plant. A minuscule amount, around 0.01%, is used today to dilate pupils during certain optical examinations, but it remains an extremely strong poison, and there is no scientific evidence of belladonna being an effective treatment for any condition. There have been several recent cases of poisoning in children due to the use of homeopathic teething aids containing belladonna that were touted as effective medicines. Conium maculatum, also known as hemlock, poison parsley, carrot fern, devil's bread, and devil's porridge, is another plant that is well known for its lethal effects. This plant has clusters of white flowers, a red spotted stem, and a long yellow root. All parts are poisonous, but the root is less so than the rest. The foul odor it gives off often stops people from eating it. Conium is derived from the Greek word to whirl, which references the vertigo-like effect the plant has before it kills. This is caused by the alkaloid coneine. Coneine acts directly on the central nervous system. Even small doses can easily cause respiratory collapse and death. For example, ingesting 6 to 8 leaves or 1 milliliter of hemlock juice. Symptoms of hemlock poisoning include nervousness, trembling, difficulty moving, dilation of the pupils, a slow, weak pulse that becomes increasingly rapid, heavy salivation, nausea, convulsions, loss of speech, paralysis, respiratory failure, and death. These symptoms follow a specific pattern. First, paralysis begins in the legs and works its way up the body, leading to paralysis of the respiratory muscles, eventually causing death by oxygen deprivation, also known as asphyxia. There is no antidote except stimulants combined with artificial ventilation, but these must be administered almost immediately. Once ventilation is provided, the effects can take 48 to 72 hours to wear off. The Greek philosopher Socrates was killed using extract of hemlock when he was accused of impiety in 399 BCE. In fact, the extract was commonly used as a sort of lethal injection for condemned criminals by the ancient Greeks, although Socrates administered his dose himself. The ancient Romans called this plant circuta, which was used until 1541 when circuta was reassigned to water hemlock, another plant which is highly poisonous. The name hemlock came into use during the Anglo-Saxon period in England, where hem meant border or shore, and lake meant plant. This refers to the fact that hemlock grows best in waste ground, such as roadsides, in hedgerows, and along the sides of pastures. During the medieval era in Europe, hemlock was said to be a treatment for the bite of a mad dog, meaning a dog with rabies. The extract was mixed with betony, a medieval favorite, with no real medical applications, and fennel juices, and then applied to the wound. This treatment was unfortunately completely ineffectual. In the 15th to 16th century, some religious sects used the roasted root of the hemlock as a pain reliever for gout when applied to the foot, and in the 1760s, a recipe existed for curing tumorous growths with hemlock. Again, these remedies didn't actually treat either of these diseases. Today, hemlock poisoning usually happens by mistake, as the leaves are often mistaken for parsley, the roots for parsnip, and the seeds for aniseed. Children can also suffer some of the effects of poisoning if they use the hollow stems as flutes or straws. Modern medical use of coniine is very limited due to its high level of toxicity. It's been tested under strict medical supervision as a treatment for epilepsy, asthma, angina, and whooping cough, but the risk of paralysis and death far outweighs its effectiveness. Another plant that contains atropine and hyoscyamine is Hyoscyamus niger, or henbane, which is also known as hogsbean, symphonica, cassellata, henbell, and fetid nightshade. All parts of this plant are poisonous, including its hairy leaves and funnel-shaped purple and yellow flowers. It both tastes and smells bad, which helps prevent animals from eating it. Still, cattle have been known to eat it with fatal results. Even a small amount ingested by a child will result in coma. The combination of atropine and hyoscyamine causes peripheral nervous system inhibition and central nervous system stimulation. The symptoms include dilated pupils, restlessness, flushing, vomiting, convulsions, rise in heart rate, high blood pressure, elevated body temperature, lack of muscle coordination, speech changes, hallucinations, delirium, coma, respiratory paralysis, and death. The initial effects last for around 3 to 4 hours, and if the victim survives, the after effects, such as dry mouth, confusion, far-sightedness, locomotor and memory disturbances, can last for days. However, overdose usually results in immediate death. Henbane has been used since around the 1st century BCE, when Dioscorides suggested it as a sedative and analgesic, or painkiller. Celsus and Pliny recommended it for use as a sleep aid when mixed with wine. During this time, henbane was referred to as herba apollinaris, and was well known for being used by the oracles of the god Apollo at his temple at Delphi to cause what were thought to be prophetic hallucinations. In the 9th century CE, a Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino near Rome recorded a method of putting patients to sleep using a sponge soaked in the extracts of henbane, opium poppy, and mandrake root. This method was called the spongia somnifera. This sponge method came from earlier classic texts and was used to ease the suffering of those that had been crucified, which was a common method of execution for the ancient Romans. In the 11th century, in Anglo-Saxon England, henbane was referred to as henbell and was used in combination with mandrake, belladonna, and datura as an anesthetic. It was also used in many so-called magic potions thanks to its psychoactive properties. In 1250 CE, Albertus Magnus, a Dominican friar, wrote in his botanical work De Vegetabilibusum that when heated, the fumes of henbane were inhaled by necromancers in order to invoke the dead and demons. Despite its bad reputation, henbane continued to be cultivated in monasteries for medicinal use. Extract of henbane in small doses has a tranquilizing effect as well as being slightly hypnotic, causing visual hallucinations and the feeling of flying. It is these last effects that contributed to henbane becoming associated with witches and the flying ointment in the medieval period. In 1597, John Gerard stated that henbane caused an uneasy sleep, similar to a drunken sleep. He recommended it for asthma, cough, stomach pain, and toothaches, but cautioned users as the plant was highly dangerous. However, henbane was so popular as an anesthetic, it was still cultivated in Europe specifically for medical purposes. It was grown in apothecary shop gardens, including London's Chelsea Physic Garden, which was founded in 1673 by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. It still grows in this garden today. Henbane's use faded after the era of apothecaries, but resurfaced in the late 1800s when Austrian physician Anton von Sturck, who had an interest in herbal medicine, recommended it as a treatment for epilepsy and other nervous disorders. In 1847, a French surgeon tried to resurrect the use of henbane as an alternative anesthetic to ether, but he was met with little enthusiasm. Ether, too, was soon abandoned as it was just as risky. Today, very precise and pure doses of henbane extract are used to assist with respiratory disorders or to relax overactive urinary bladders. A recent study showed that methanol extracts from the seeds of henbane reduced seizures, body rigidity, and loss of voluntary movement in mice, which shows potential for a future drug to alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Fun fact, henbane was used to bitter and flavor beer, most notably in Pilsen in what is now the Czech Republic. In this form, henbane was known as Bilsenkraut and was used up until the 11th century or so to make Pilsner beer. It was later replaced by hops, which was much safer to work with. Another occasional ingredient of the flying ointment I'll briefly mention, even though it's not known for being fatally poisonous, is mandrake, or Mandragora officinarum. The roots of the whole genus of plants known as Mandragora grow in a vaguely human shape, one that is distorted and bulbous, and contains many highly active alkaloids. Mandragora has a long history of association with magic, mythology, and poisoning, thanks to its hallucinogenic properties. Even today, mandrake is sometimes included in contemporary pagan traditions, though this is not recommended. The most active alkaloids present in mandragora roots include atropine, hyoscyamine, scopolamine, cuscohygrine, and apoatropine. In addition to alkaloids, over 80 other substances have been identified within the mandrake root, as reported in 2005 by a group of Czech analytical chemists led by Lumír André Hanus, who is known mainly for his research on cannabis. Because of the presence of these alkaloids, ingestion of mandrake brings on hallucinations as well as a deep sleep, but it's not often fatal. Mandrake roots were found in the tomb of ancient Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, which dates to 1323 BCE. As evidenced by the writings of Dioscorides, mandrake was very important as an anesthetic for surgeries in ancient Greece, as it inhibits nerve impulses of pain. It was also thought to be a fertility symbol at this time, and was used as an aphrodisiac. During the medieval era, the mandrake was considered a magical substance, and its removal from the earth was the subject of many illustrations. This is due to the tale that pulling up a mandrake causes it to cry with such force that the sound kills whoever hears it. Therefore, animals were used to pull up the roots, by tying them to the plant and forcing the animal to run. Mandrake was used in later centuries to treat convulsions, melancholy, and mania, and the juice was used in ointments for rheumatism and childbirth pains. It is no longer used in modern medicine, as there are other drugs that are more effective and safer to use. I could definitely do an entire episode on the mandrake, so let me know if you're interested. For now, I'll move on to the next toxic plant. One of the most addictive and historically important plants, one that caused 2 wars between England and China in the mid-19th century, is the opium poppy, or Papaver somniferum. The substance we know as opium is the dried latex produced by the seed pod of this plant. This latex contains the alkaloids morphine, thebaine, codeine, papaverine, noscapine, and eripavine. The seeds contain very low levels of opiates, and the oil extracted from them contains even less, which is why these do not cause any narcotic effects, and are a very popular and harmless food ingredient, though drug tests can still detect their presence. Opiates, or the alkaloids derived from the opium poppy, are potent painkillers and muscle relaxers. They cause drowsiness, sedation, slow respiration, and slow heartbeat, as well as a state of euphoria. The human body quickly develops a tolerance to opiates, so progressively larger doses are needed to achieve the same effect. Opiates are also highly addictive, producing a physical dependence, and without continuous use, withdrawal symptoms will occur, which can also be fatal. The habitual use of opium produces physical and mental deterioration, rapidly reducing the human lifespan. An acute overdose of opium causes fatal respiratory failure. Ingesting 3.5 milliliters of opium latex on its own can be fatal. I could do an entire episode on the history of opium, so I'll briefly summarize for the sake of brevity in this episode. The narcotic and anesthetic effects of this plant were realized quite early, around 4000 BCE in ancient Sumerian depictions, and it was utilized by many ancient cultures. The opium poppy fell out of use during the Middle Ages, possibly due to its association with witchcraft, but made a comeback during the European rise of medicine and surgery. One of the most commonly used medicines for everything from anxiety to surgery was laudanum, which was a tincture of opium, alcohol, and water. Opium was also smoked recreationally from the 14th century in many parts of the Old World. Today, the alkaloids of opium poppy are still used as anesthetics, such as morphine, while some of its other compounds are used to create heroin, a very dangerous and addictive drug. Caution is recommended when prescribing opiates, as opiate addiction is a huge issue all across the world, but especially in first world countries. The last toxic plant I want to talk about was sometimes added to the witch's flying ointment. This species of poisonous plant is known as datura and includes thornapple, stramonium, jimson weed, devil's trumpet, moonflowers, toloach, kanaka, and stinkweed. As hinted by the last name, the leaves of these plants smell quite bad. The origins of datura are unknown, but it's been cultivated all over the world due to its hallucinogenic properties. The most well-known of these is datura stramonium. The whole plant is poisonous, but especially the seeds, which sit inside a spiny fruit. They contain the alkaloids scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. Even the honey produced by certain wasps from the pollen of datura can contain these toxins. Symptoms of datura poisoning include an increase in body temperature, bizarre and violent behavior, severely decreased respiration to the point of asphyxiation, dilated pupils with painful photophobia for days afterwards, irregular heartbeat, terrifying hallucinations, delirium, temporary paralysis, pronounced amnesia, and death. Even moderate doses can leave a person motionless and delusional. Datura has a long history of causing delirium and death in both Europe and India. The first mention of this toxic plant goes back to around 400 to 200 BCE in Ayurvedic medicine, a system of medicine with historical roots in the Indian subcontinent. These texts suggest a small amount of datura could be used as an aphrodisiac. Datura was also important to certain Hindu cults, as it was believed that datura was showered down upon the earth from paradise. In ancient India, it was used as a sedative as well as an antiseptic and a treatment for rashes, edema, rectal prolapse, inflammation, and menstrual cramps when used in an ointment. Datura was also well known among the ancient Greeks and Romans. Dioscorides made note of its psychoactive properties. It was smoked as a drug in East Africa, as well as being added to beer to make it more intoxicating. In Europe, as I already mentioned, it was linked to witchcraft as one of the classic witches' weeds. It was also used in the Americas. Several indigenous peoples of North and South America were recorded by 18th and 19th century anthropologists as using Datura's hallucinogenic properties to contact ancestors, spirits, and dream guides. These peoples included the Navajo Havasupai, the Southern Paiute, the Chumash, and the Aztecs. During archaeological excavations on the U.S. and Mexican border, vessels shaped like datura fruit were unearthed from contexts dated to between 700 and 1000 CE. This suggests the plant was commonly used in this area. In Haitian voodoo, a bokor, or sorcerer, was said to use datura as an ingredient of zombie powder, a white, powdery compound which creates a zombie using necromancy. Datura was not only popular in the past. The Thugi, an Indian criminal group, added datura to food in order to stupefy their victims while they robbed and then strangled them. Between 1950 and 1965, state chemical labs in Agra, India, investigated over 2,778 deaths caused by ingesting datura. Today, those who have been poisoned usually become so by attempting to use datura as a recreational drug. The hallucinations it causes are often terrifying, and the risk of poisoning is very high. The only thing that can be done once poisoning occurs is to pump the stomach and use activated charcoal to absorb as much of the poison as possible. The symptoms usually take between 24 and 36 hours to resolve. There is no modern medical use of datura. I wanted to include even more toxic plants in this episode, such as curare and suicide tree, but I just ran out of time. I could read and write about toxic plants all day. They've fascinated me since my mother took me around her garden as a child and showed me all the plants I shouldn't touch. Thank you, Mom. You were right about every single one. If you want to know more, there are several excellent books I can recommend, such as Death in the Garden by Michael Brown and Poisonous Plants, A Cultural and Social History by Robert Bevan Jones. Also, let me know if you want to hear about other interesting plants, such as more hallucinogenic or carnivorous plants. I just find them so interesting. Plants seem innocent, but the substances they carry can be very dangerous. Please think twice before eating unfamiliar berries while hiking or drinking tea made from unfamiliar plant leaves. Make sure you know your house plants and to keep those that are toxic out of reach of pets and children. Do your research thoroughly. There's no need to be afraid of plants, but please understand that they aren't just pretty to look at. They are living things with mechanisms to defend themselves from those that would eat them. Humans have used these mechanisms throughout history for our own devices, for better or worse, which is why toxic plants have earned our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media. And please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like SpoopyGirl95, Tommy Tomcat, Shay, Carl, Jessalopod, Silly Single SJ, Heather, Annie M, Michaela, Melissa, Tori, Stacy, Emily, Lee, Andrew, Tiffany, Lori, Alice, Caitlin, Danielle, John, and Morris. Mina, Rebecca, and Rachel all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you. Also, a huge thank you to Chris Ledwell, who sent us a book on witchcraft just in time for this episode. If you'd like to send us a book, there are a variety to choose from on our Amazon wishlist at bit.ly/morbidwishlist, and our mailing address is on our website. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate it. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook. so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.